Good morning, Fremd High School. How are you all?
Good. How about you?
Good. I'm really good. I got charged up from that last one. I love talking to high school students. You guys really sort of inspire me. I'm just getting started on my next book, and it takes a long time. And sometimes I run out of energy, and I wonder. And then I talk to people like you, and it sort of revs me up to get it done because it really makes it worth it. The other thing I want to say before I get started is. It's the last day of Writers Week, and how's that going for you all? All right. I want you to know what an amazing program it is here. I was at St. Louis the day before yesterday at Hazelwood West High School, where they have a program just like this, which they modeled after yours. So you guys are a blueprint to others. And I was talking to a new editor I'm working with at the New York Times Magazine, and he said, "What are you doing exactly? Where are you?" And I explained, and he said, "Wow, I've never heard anything like that." And I hadn't either. It's quite extraordinary. And in New York City, they have nothing like you've got going on here right here.
Tell them to write a story about it.
Yes, actually, yes. So use this experience, write about it. Anything unusual that happens this week. In fact, before I'll get off track right away, which I'll do many times. How many people are interested in possibly being a writer here, or a journalist, or anything like that? Oh, good, good. Okay, so several of you. Pull out your notepad or your paper, whoever wants to be a writer, and your pen. Hold it up. All right. Once you have, oh, good, you have one. If you want to be a writer, you always have to have paper and a pencil with you, or a pen, or something to write with. These are your tools. I can't stand having a notepad in my pocket, and I don't always have my backpack around when I'm riding a bike or something. I fold up a piece of paper. I tore a piece of this off into quarters like this. I just shove it in my back pocket. I always have it with me. Then I write on each little one. I have 8 little surfaces to write on. But anytime anything interesting happens to you, stop what you're doing, take 30 seconds or a minute or wherever it is, and write it down. Or if you hear somebody say something that seems a little odd or different, or it strikes you in a way, write it down. That's dialogue you can use. There's nothing like real life. Best material out there in the world. Okay, so I want to talk about Columbine and some things related to it. And I'd like to start out with a question. Why did they do it? Why did 2 boys walk into their high school one morning and start shooting people in the head? What a terrible question. I shouldn't have to ask things like that. And we had never had to ask a question like that in this country. Nothing like that had ever happened in America before. It shocked the entire country. And unfortunately, we in the media, believe it or not, try to answer that question too quickly. With good intentions, we tried to understand what had happened before we had the information to get it right. And I'm going to hold right up here. We messed them around from the last session, but I'm going to hold up many of the answers of why they did it. Right here in my hand. These are the journals left behind by the 2 killers. They also left videotapes and a lot of other information, so we have more information to go on. But here's the most important stuff right here. Eric was the mastermind, and here's his journal for 1 year talking about why he did it. Here's Dylan's journal for 2 years, mostly not talking about why he's going to do it, mostly talking about himself and how he's not planning to do it. Very, very different story. So we can understand why, and I'm going to come back to why. That was the first big question that drove me for 10 years to follow this story, to want to research it, understand it, and write about it, and to convey it to people like you. Before that ever happened, though, something else drove me on. And it happened the second day after Columbine. Because the day it happened, I was a journalist, and I actually hadn't been a journalist for quite some time. It was only my second story in 20 years. But I thought something important might be going on. I heard the first reports, and I got in my car, and I just drove out there. And there were reports of injuries, some gunfire, no deaths. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know where the school was, so I just drove out. I was living in Denver. I drove out to that part of the Metroplex in the general direction. And I drove until I saw a circle of helicopters to the south, circling around, like 6 of them. And it was a terribly ominous sight. And that was my first clue that this was much worse than I thought.
So I got off at the next exit, and I literally just drove toward the helicopters. And I drove till I had a police barricade. And then I got on foot. I asked the cop, which way is the high school? Because it's sort of rolling hill, so you couldn't see the school, even though I was about a mile away. He said that way, and I just went running toward it on foot. And the first building I got to, where there were all sorts of people congregating, turned out to be one of two rendezvous points. And there were a lot of parents there, not so many kids yet. And the first student, the first survivor I talked to, was a girl named Robin Soroncione. She was a sophomore, real slight girl, and I could not believe what she started telling me. I asked her what had happened and what had she seen, and she started talking a mile a minute. It went something like, there were blasts and we didn't know what it was, and it was shooting, and then we were running, and they said, everybody get down, so we went under the tables, and they said, no, run! So everybody got up and we ran, and we were running down the hallway, and we didn't know which way to go, and the teacher was crying, and we were in the elevator, it was full, and we had to get out, and then I didn't know what to do, and there was gunfire, and there was smoke in the hallway, and we didn't know what was going to happen. And she went on and on and on like that relentlessly. And pretty much most of the kids I talked to today, that day, were like that. They were... It also varied by when they got out of the school. Some kids were trapped in there for up to 3 or 4 hours. And when they were rescued by the SWAT team, I happened to be in a place where the media was congregating, where I saw those kids just about 5 minutes after they came out of the school. And those kids were sobbing, they were holding each other. They just looked like they had been through something awful. And it was a really tough day, obviously. It wasn't particularly surprising. It was kind of what you would expect when, people witnessing something horrible. The next day is what shocked me. Overnight, they had changed. They came back to Clement Park, which is a big, mile-wide park that surrounds the school, beautiful area near the mountains. They're right by the Rockies. And all the kids had congregated there just to mourn, building makeshift memorials. And while they were doing this, nobody was crying. They weren't really expressing any kind of emotion. When they were hugging, they weren't like clenching each other and holding for dear life like they did the first day. They would just walk up and give a little hug and walk away. And they were just walking sort of lifelessly, sort of like that. They had blank expressions on their faces. And at first I didn't want to ask them about it. I didn't want to be the jerk reporter who said, why aren't you kids crying? And particularly the boys were completely devoid of emotion. And so I talked to a group of boys finally about, I figured out to say, I asked them about some other boys, and I said, I noticed some of the boys aren't really crying. And they said, I know! They were so ready to talk to an adult about it. And they all told me, I know, I stopped crying at like 3 a.m. in the morning, or sometimes 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever. They knew, oddly enough, they knew exactly when they had stopped crying. And nobody had gotten asleep that I met. And I talked to hundreds of kids. But they knew exactly when they had stopped crying, because it wasn't a gradual thing, it was like a switch going off. Suddenly, they went numb. They could not feel anything. And I quickly learned that that's numbness, and that's very common. It usually sets in later. But with something this intense, your brain just shuts down and realizes this is dangerous. I can't deal with any more of this emotional turmoil. Cutting that off. I'm not going to take it in anymore. So I was really kind of freaked out by those kids and what was going on, and I was worried about them. I didn't know if they were going to get over it. I didn't know if this was going to haunt them for life, or maybe they would be okay. But it really kind of terrified me. So that question of what happened to those kids, that was the first thing that got me going. And that's when I knew I had to keep coming back. I didn't realize at that point I was going to write a book. I just knew I needed to keep writing stories and follow them, and the answer wasn't going to come in a week or two. That it was going to be more like 5 years or 10 years. I didn't really, I never expected to be spending 10 years on it, but I thought I'd be back for a year or 2 or 3, and I'd come back periodically and see what had happened to them. And later on, when I did figure out to write a book on this, it took me a lot of different attempts, and I went through 3 different publishers and zillions of rewrites, because it took me a long time to figure it out and how I wanted to tell it. And I had a deal with Random House, which was originally an ebook, and then it was expanded into a larger book, and I wrote the entire book. It was 300 pages. We edited it, and it just wasn't good enough after 3 years into it. And I felt that way, my publisher felt that way, and so we dropped the book and set it aside, and I went back to trying to understand the killers. I still didn't understand that. And then 5 years out, I felt I had a good handle on it, and I set out with a completely new project, threw away all the writing I had done, and started over with a different way of looking at it, where I really wanted to tell two stories. And those are the two big questions that I had originally. Why did they do it, and what happened to the people that lived through it? And I wanted to tell it from a lot of different points of view, because I realized, you know, the world is different from how you see it. If I were going to tell the story of Fremd High School and what life is like here, I could pick you in the front row, this boy here. I could tell what life is like for you. I could use this young lady over here. I could go one of your teachers, one of the AV people, the administration, a parent. Everybody has a completely different view of what life is like in the same situation. And particularly something dramatic like Columbine, there were all sorts of different people who saw it completely differently. So I decided I want to take 10 people, oh, let's put you there, 10 people, and tell it from their points of view. And the way I describe them in my book proposal, I really had to boil it down and understand what I was writing about and the ideas here. And this helps me with my writing to really sort of crystallize. And so the 10 characters were the good cop, the bad cop, the angry dad, the Christian martyr who turned out not to be a martyr, the boy in the window, the heroic teacher who died saving children, the principal who guided the kids out of this emotional wasteland, the minister who did something extraordinary and ruined his career because of it. Excuse me. And the two killers. And those are two different killers because they're completely different people. There is Eric Harris, why did he do it? And there is Dylan Klebold, such a different guy, and why he did it. So those are the 10 people, and that's what I focused the book on. And I want to tell you about one or two of those people. I guess I'll start with, for time, I'm going to tell you maybe just about the boy in the window, Patrick Ireland. He was kind of an extraordinary person. He was the last seriously injured person to leave the building alive. And he left an unusual route. He went out the second-story window. And the timing was also unusual because President Clinton had just addressed the nation from the Oval Office with a very short address to reassure the country because everybody was watching this live on national television. It had been going on for hours. Nobody knew what was happening. It seemed to be a hostage standoff with hundreds of kids trapped in the building and no one knew if they were going to live or die. So he addressed the country to reassure us, saying his prayers and thoughts were going out to Littleton, Colorado. That ended. CNN cut almost within seconds to something that was going on inside the building that one of the news helicopters circling the building picked up. Somebody seemed to be inside the building, moving inside the second story of the windows. And then they realized, my God, he looks like he's going to jump. So a SWAT team got into an armored car, barreled toward the school. 2 SWAT team members clambered up onto the roof, reached up just as he went out the window, grabbed him, and pulled him down. At that point, they got him onto the ground and told him they were going to take him to the hospital. And he said, okay, and tried to get into the front seat. He was very confused. He didn't realize he was the patient. He also fell trying to get in because half of his body was paralyzed, but he didn't understand that. The reason he didn't understand it is because 3 hours earlier, he'd been shot in the head. And he'd been shot, if he was right about here, the window that he finally went out to was about here by these lights right by the end of the stage. That took 3 hours to get from there to there. He went in and out of consciousness and did a zigzaggy line to get there, which we know because he was bleeding profusely, and unfortunately there's a horrible trail on the carpet. He had been shot in the head, and a bullet had gone 6 inches through his brain, and he was injured much worse than he thought. And it got worse as the day went on. He went into surgery, and when he came out, his parents were told he would never walk or talk again. Patrick Ireland had different ideas. He was determined to fight back and to walk. He had told his parents a couple of years earlier that he was going to be valedictorian at Columbine High. He was a junior now, and he'd never gotten a B. He was on his way. He also liked sports. He played in basketball, and he wasn't like one of the best kids, but he loved playing it. And he also loved water skiing and competitively. And a couple weeks afterwards, he told his parents, or asked them, through very belabored speech. He could barely talk, and so when any of the things that I say Patrick said might have taken him a minute or two to get out of his mouth, but I'm giving you the shortened version. But he said, what am I getting out of here? I need to get back on the basketball court. I need to be practicing. And they didn't know how to tell him, you're never going to be walking again. You know, he knew things were bad and that everybody else thought they were much worse, and he was planning to get better. And he set his mind to it, and every day he worked like crazy. And there's much more to this story, but I'm happy to report in the long run, he walked again, he learned to talk again, he walked with a speech therapist, he learned how to basically reroute neural pathways in his brain and to think again. A little more than a year later, he graduated valedictorian from Columbine High. He went on to Colorado State University, and there he graduated magna cum laude. He walked again. He did water ski again, not competitively, not particularly well, but he enjoys it. He walks with a limp now. He has a brace that he'll wear for life. He has to take anti-seizure medication every day for life. But other than that, he's well. He's happy. He's a very successful career right now. He got promoted a couple of years ago. He leads a whole team of people. He got married about 3 or 4 years ago. He danced at his own wedding. And he's happy. One of the key things, there were a couple big reasons that he recovered. And one of them is he set his mind to it, he was determined to do it. And he worked like crazy at it. One of the other things that he attributes his recovery to was just a few weeks after Columbine, he decided to forgive the killers. And when he told his mom, again, through very sort of belabored speech, this took a long time to get out for her to understand. When she understood what he was trying to say, she thought he was just doped up on the medication when he said to just forgive them. And because she's a very, very nice lady, I've spent a lot of time with her, but she's not that nice that she was ready to forgive these kids who tried to kill her son. But he was. In his hospital bed, she'd just gotten out of the ICU. And he said, just let it go. He's like, what, are you crazy? But he realized from very early on that he was never going to get better by being angry or bitter or focusing on the past or what anybody else had done to him. All he could think about was moving on. And he played sports, he played the league when he was a kid, and when he was doing that, he said he learned very early, you know, when you drop a fly ball, whatever you do, that you screw up, you just gotta let it go and put it behind you. If you drop that ball and you spend the next 10 minutes beating yourself in the head, like, oh, why did I do that? You know, I'm an idiot, oh God, I can't believe that. And you're just gonna drop the next one, or the next play. You're not gonna have your head in the game. What you need to do is, that's the past. I dropped it, doesn't matter anymore. What's the next thing? And focus on that. And that's the kind of logic and clear-headed thinking he applied to his recovery. And you know, he told me years later, about 7 years afterwards, when I was interviewing him, he was talking about his foot and little problems he had. Like he still had the brace, so it's inside his shoe, so he'd wear a size 10 on one shoe and 11 on the other. And it was a hassle when he bought shoes, and little things like that were annoying. And he said, yeah, you know, it still pisses my dad off, kind of, the doctors didn't set it. And I said, pisses your dad off? What about you? He said, no. And I looked at him like, come on, Patrick, it's got to bug you. And he said, I have so many more important things to worry about. There's just no point in looking back. And I was amazed that anybody could actually live that way, because, you know, I try to live that way, and I know it makes sense, but Patrick actually does it. And, you know, I really want to talk just really briefly about another young lady, Val Schnur, who was shot by a couple shotgun blasts, and she had 36 buckshot pellets in her body. Her arm, she showed me about 10 years later, it just looked like somebody had taken a knife and just shredded it. And her abdomen was even worse, she told me. I didn't see that. She almost died from her wounds. And then she had 3 reconstructive surgeries over the next several years, had a really rough time, and she did not forgive the killers a couple of weeks out. She was very angry for several years. And she remembers very clearly on the 5th anniversary there were a lot of news stories, and she was doing really horribly. She didn't really want to participate in a lot of interviews because she said, you know, I didn't want to be that loser girl who her life was completely messed up. But then a few years later, about 8 years afterwards, she made a decision to forgive them and also to change her life. She had gone, she had lived in sort of a daze after this happened because she was really traumatized by it. And she'd gone to college and she'd majored in finance and gone into banking, and she realized she didn't really like it. You know, it was fine for a lot of people, and some of her friends that she worked with liked it, but it wasn't for her. She really wanted to be a social worker. So she decided to make some changes. The first thing she was going to do was let go of her anger. And she couldn't do that immediately. You know, you can't just decide something like that and it happens overnight. But gradually, she did. She let go of it. She says today, I bear no ill will toward either of those kids who tried to kill me. I'm okay. She went back to grad school, got a degree in social work. She's getting married now too. Loves what she does for a living. She helps kids in trouble, and she's gone on. She's having a wonderful life. I want to talk briefly. I want to get to some of your questions, but I want to talk really briefly about a couple of things we've learned. And so I'm going to just jump way ahead here to the most important thing that we learned. Way back. Actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. How are we doing on time? What time do we get out of here again?
About 15, 16 minutes.
15, 16 minutes. Okay. Good. So, forgot to tell you about the killers. I think you want to know that part. I wanted to come back to that, and I want to give you just a really quick thumbnail of them, because it's much more complicated, and I spent about 200 pages on them. But I can tell you the most important characteristics of the killers and the central ideas of why they did it. This is Eric's journal, and it starts with the phrase, I'll clean up this language, I hate the effing world. And it's hate, hate, hate all the way through this. He was a clinical psychopath. Now, who's familiar with psychopaths from movies like Hannibal Lecter or books or anything like that? Okay, just about everybody? Okay, forget everything you know from that. A psychopath is a clinical term for which Hollywood has completely run away and made up something silly for the movies. A psychopath is somebody who has no feeling for other people, no compassion, no empathy. For them, if I could make $10 or kill you, I'll kill you. They usually won't kill you because they don't want to go to jail. They're very rational people, they know exactly what they're doing, they just don't care. And so they won't do something like that because it has consequences, but they would if they could. Most of them become con artists, white-collar criminals, crooked politicians. Your former governor here, you're all familiar with Mr. Blagojevich. He has a lot of the characteristics of a psychopath. Bernie Madoff. This is the kind of person, very charming. In fact, one of the 20 key characteristics of a psychopath is charming. He's never the person you think is a psychopath. Brilliant manipulators. They're after money, status, power, sex. Things that drive most people, they're just ruthless about doing it, and they don't care what happens to you. Bernie Madoff, the guy who stole the $50 billion or whatever from Wall Street, classic example. And now he's just come out with his first interviews last week, blaming everybody else, saying in some ways he was a victim. Totally like a psychopath. It's just all about them. They're very, very incredible sense of superiority and contempt for everybody else, which they mask by pretending they care about you, but it's all an act. So that was Eric. Now, there are a lot of psychopaths, but most of them are, they're going to rip you off, but they're not physically dangerous because there's nothing in it for them. But in the rare cases where you have a psychopath who's also a really sadistic person, who's usually torturing small animals as a child and enjoys just being mean to other people, then you have somebody who's like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, or Eric Harris. He's from that mold. And luckily, very few of these shootings, almost never a psychopath. He's really sort of a rare case. Now, he was the mastermind of it. His partner, Dylan, was completely different. I told you that Eric's journal was all about hate. Here is Dylan's journal that he kept for 2 years, sort of pouring out his soul in a traditional way. And you can back up to some of the pages from his journal. Here's some pages. Now, it's not every page, but quite a few of the pages I just pulled out here. And by the way, the black parts, that's just the cops blacked out names. Does this look like the journal of a mass murderer? No, I didn't think so. I was shocked when it came out. This took 7 years before this was released. And that gets back to why we came to these answers before we had the information. Dylan was extremely depressed. He was a loving kid. He had a lot of love in him, but also a lot of anger. It's not all hearts in there and flowers. There's a lot of anger in here. Does anybody want to take a guess at, anybody who has not read the book, at who is he the most angry at? What one person is the object of his anger most? Go ahead. Himself. Did you read it? Okay, you're smart audience. Most people, that's the fifth or sixth guess. You know, people think his parents, teachers, people picked on him, other people at school, blah, blah, blah. No, it was him. He's very, very angry at himself, and then also quite a bit at God. Why did you make me this way? I'm miserable, I'm a failure, nobody likes me, I don't have any friends. None of that was true. His daytime was also released, full with activities. You know, he had lots of friends, did all sorts of things, but he couldn't see it that way. He's deeply depressed, and there's a lot more about depression on my website, and there's warning signs there too. But depression is very different from sadness. It's when you're stuck in a very deeply morose state for a long period of time, and you're stuck and you can't get out. And the biggest thing that I want people to, that I want you all to take away from depression is how prevalent it is and how easy it is to do something about it. The estimates are right now that 6% of all adolescents in the country are clinically depressed. That means severe problem. That's 2 million kids. And in a school, there's 3,000 kids here. That means 180 kids you know in your school are dealing with this right now. Think about that. It's 180 kids. Most of them undiagnosed, need help and not getting it. Now, it's very easy to diagnose, can be done in a few minutes, and treatment is also easy to get. There are only 2 people who cannot be involved in diagnosing the problem or evaluating or screening you for depression. And who wants to guess who are those 2 people who cannot help figure it out? Anybody? Go ahead. Pardon? Yourself? No? Good guess, but not it. Who else? It's hard for me to see. Anybody back there? Just shout it out. Over here? Your parents. Your parents. The reason is, I remember when I was a kid, this may be you, this is most kids, you want to please your parents. You want them to be proud of you. You don't want them to worry about you. We hide things from our parents when things aren't going well. Some kids do talk to their parents and open up, which is great, and I encourage you to do that. Realistically, most kids, and the older you get, aren't going to do that. But most kids will open up to a teacher that they trust, or a counselor, or other family doctor, ask you a bunch of questions, and usually just tell them the truth. So anybody can screen for it except your parents. The parents are usually the last people to know. So if you have a friend or yourself who you think might be in trouble, either talk to that person or talk to some adult. I mean, and it's not about turning them in. It's not about getting them in trouble, because there's no problem having it except getting treatment. It's talking to somebody, some teacher or some counselor or somebody, and saying, hey, you know, my buddy, I think might have a problem. Can somebody kind of quietly talk to him and see if he needs help, get him help? It's just about getting help for people. So I want you to think about this in the coming days, in the next couple of years, and also while you're in college. It's a big problem during college-age kids and in high school. If you've got somebody who thinks might need help, check out the warning signs and talk to them about getting help. That's the one thing I would like you all to do. All right, now I want to open up to questions, and use up most of your time. 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Okay, go ahead. I'll try to make them quick. Who's got questions? Oh, you were just. Oh, go ahead. How did I get the journals? That was easy in the end. There was a court battle that all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court. The Denver Post brought. And they were forced to be released. And so they were released to the media. Earlier in that, during the early years, it was a real struggle. I actually got the first leaked passages. I got someone on the inside to share them with me after I had built up trust with that person. In the end, it all came out, but it was a long way getting there. Go ahead.